Shalee Peters joining you now from the Nebraska Farmers Union annual convention going on here in Grand Island. And I've got here with me National Farmers Union President Roger Johnson. Thank you for joining us this year, Roger, here in Nebraska. A lot to talk about as we get headed into a new year. Of course, the RFS just being released, an upcoming expected release on country of origin labeling. So we'll get an update from you on a lot of those. But why don't you just start off by talking about 2015 and some of the things that the National Farmers Union has been up to.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks. First of all, it's great to be here in Nebraska. I'm from North Dakota, so anytime I get out of D.C. and get sort of to the middle of the country, that's a good thing. Yeah, this has been an interesting year. It's been challenging in a lot of ways. I think more recently, we've had a couple of really notable wins. Keeping crop insurance intact, that was a big deal. I mean, to get a deal that struck between the president and at least all the Republican leadership in the House and the Senate, and then to be able to overturn a piece of that was a big deal. And all of us in agriculture just got on that very quickly because a part of that deal was to do a big $3 billion cut to crop insurance. And what we extracted as a part of our aggressively facing this issue was a promise that not only would that $3 billion get restored, but it wouldn't be taken from other parts of the agriculture budget, which was a really big deal. And so I think we won that one. The transportation bill, this got attached, and it looks like that issue is over and safe, and that's a good thing. So there's those kinds of things, lots of appropriations issues that we've worked on this past year. But as you indicated, I mean, the hot issues right now, probably the hottest one is country of origin labeling, because you've got this final decision coming out of the WTO, which unfortunately ruled against the U.S. mandatory country of origin labeling law as it relates to beef and pork. And so we had sort of this knee-jerk reaction on the part of the House of Representatives where they went in and repealed that law. In fact, they didn't just repeal the law with respect to beef and pork, but they also repealed it with respect to ground beef and ground pork and poultry, none of which the WTO found any problem with. So, I mean, that was very much an overreaction on the part of the House that happened last summer. Now that we've got this final decision expected early next week, there's talk about putting something on the omnibus bill, which is really the last place you want to debate issues because there's no debate. I mean, the omnibus bill is this huge bill that includes funding for almost all of the government, and it may have as many as 100 or more riders, they call them, which are separate pieces of legislation that nobody could get passed during the year, so now they stick them on this bill, and it's this huge, huge bill that has a very limited amount of time for debate and almost has to pass, because if you don't pass it, you shut the government down. So it's like the antithesis of how the democracy ought to work, the process ought to work. But that's the spot we're in. So we have a very good narrow fix that we've been advocating, which is to simply make those parts that are repealed voluntary. And that's important because absent putting a voluntary label requirement out there, what the packing industry, the meat packing industry will do is they'll bring animals in from anywhere in the world, slaughter them here, put a made in the U.S. label on that animal. And what the Hoeven-Stabenow voluntary bill that we have been promoting would do is it solves the WTO problem because it gets rid of mandatory cool and it replaces it with a voluntary program. But that voluntary program says if you want to put product of the USA on any meat product, it has to be an animal that was born, raised, and slaughtered in the U.S. You cannot deceive consumers into believing they're eating a U.S. product by bringing in stuff from out of country and then simply processing it here and then putting a U.S. label on, which would be permitted if they simply repeal mandatory cool and don't replace it with this voluntary approach. So it's a big issue for us. Who knows how that's going to play out, because there's so many forces at work on this omnibus piece. But we intend to do everything we can to raise the public profile of this issue, because 90% of consumers for over 10 years in surveys strongly support mandatory country of origin labeling. Every beef, pork, poultry producer I know in the U.S., they want to put their label on that product. They're proud of what they do in raising animals in this country. And so they want that label to have integrity. If it says product of the U.S., they want it to be produced in the U.S. So it's a really important issue for us. And it's one of those issues that Farmers Union was the initial potent force behind it getting adopted into law way back in 2002, and then again in 2008, and we've been champions of it for decades, literally decades. And it's an issue that really kind of originated in Nebraska, at Nebraska Farmers Union, so it's important for us.
All right. Switching gears just a little bit here, country of origin labeling, I'm sure, is something we will continue to visit with you about. But the RFS just released final volumes coming out here very recently, and some mixed reaction from the industry, kind of a general attitude of, well, it's better, but not quite maybe where it needs to be. Talk about that.
Yeah. Well, it is better than what was initially proposed. There's no question about that. What they proposed was absolutely nonsensical. It didn't follow the spirit or the letter of the law, either one. And so we were deeply opposed to that. And what is now been released is better than that. It's still not good enough, in our opinion. And the reason I say that is because the fundamental importance of the RFS is based on a couple of things. Number one, it's probably the most significant rural economic development policy this country has had in my lifetime. There's no question that it has transformed the countryside in many, many, many ways and added significant income to farmers of all stripes, not just corn producers. So it's been very important. That's number one. Number two, it provided a long-term time horizon out to the year 2022 with increasing levels of biofuels having access to the petroleum liquid fuels transportation market. And so that was really important because it gave certainty to the industry that's investing billions of dollars in bringing these biofuel plants up and running. And they knew that if they invested that money, it was going to take some years to get a return back on that. And they knew that they had a number of years of certainty in the market, of ever-increasing access to the market. Obviously, they knew they had to be competitive. The RFS says nothing about that you have to put this product in the marketplace at this price or that price. It doesn't deal with prices at all. It just simply says if you can produce it economically and at a price point that consumers will buy, you will have access to the market. That's very, very important. And what EPA did in their final rule is they reduced the corn ethanol requirement by 500 million gallons below what was in the statute. And it is that piece that we find most objectionable, because there has never been a problem with the corn ethanol industry being able to ramp up and produce what was in the law. It's always been there. They even have produced in excess, so there's no good reason to cut that back unless you believe the oil companies who say 10% is the maximum, we're not going to put more than 10% in the fuel supply, which is an absolute farce. EPA itself has determined that something like 80+% of all the automobiles on the road today, built after 2001, can run on E15. So that alone would increase the total capacity by about 50%. And then you got all these E85 vehicles and other ways of using this ethanol in the market. So that was a that was really a bitter pill to swallow.
Well, thank you so much, Roger. Roger Johnson, National Farmers Union President, here with us at the Nebraska Farmers Union Annual Convention going on in Grand Island. For the Rural Radio Network, I'm Shalee Peters.